studying up on urban economics, and I've read that von Thunen in 1827 basically laid it out and said the center part is the most productive part of a city, will be the most expensive, and everyone commutes, and the less money you have, the further you commute. And it seems to be happening. And so why are not mainstream economists saying, hey, we solved this 200 years ago, that's the way it is? You're the only one talking. Thank you.
Yes, that is one of the sort of, it's a 19th century German model of cities that we learn. I think if I were going to play their role, what they're saying is people are commuting farther and longer than they would if we did this zoning shock. That we're not playing to the natural forces by making the center bigger and denser. So in a way, the von Thunen model would sort of go in their direction. The problem is if we don't think the filtering or the trickle-down part of the von Thunen model would work under contemporary circumstances, and that's what I'm saying.
Over here. We'll get to the back, don't worry.
This may be a little bit off your main topic, but I'm sort of curious your attitude or knowledge of the issue. It seems to me that people are talking as if it's inevitable that the large superstar cities become larger and denser and greater black holes attracting all the talent. And yet we have a country that's deeply divided, not only economically, but socially and politically because of the segregation this is causing. Is that kind of aggregation inevitable? Or are there things that our government and our people can do to actually encourage more active diversification, splitting up of the economic development so that we have fewer of these pyramids and they're spread out more and we actually spread the wealth a little bit more within this state and with our country? What's your feeling on that?
Well, thank you for asking that question because it happens to be the problem that I'm actually most working on these days, which is this split. So let me give you some context on it. You're adding a scale, and the scale is we're not just talking about housing within the metropolitan area, but about the overall distribution of population and wealth across the country into different cities. And so here's something people need to know. Not only is income inequality at the highest point since the early 20th century, that is between people, but the inequality of income between our regions is higher than it's been in about 100 years, right? And we know that that's, of course, seems to be deeply affecting, for example, our political life, with a split between red and blue, but most especially the split is between prosperous metropolitan areas and basically everywhere else. So in this debate, actually, it's a dimension I didn't talk about in this talk because there wasn't enough time, but another chapter in the narrative is that if the NIMBYs in the prosperous coastal cities would simply allow more housing to be built, that all of these people in less prosperous parts of the United States would flow toward our big cities. And the vision is, here's the scenario, our big cities or metropolitan areas would get bigger, that those people would get better jobs. It's a trickle down, it's a trickle over to trickle down theory. They would tap into our opportunity systems, and so we would get bigger and the national economy would grow faster, but at the price of depleting those other regions of population. So we can't bring opportunity to them, they have to come to opportunity. And there have been simulations, the most famous ones were done by two people at Berkeley who did simulations that under a completely unregulated housing market, that the Bay Area would grow 5-fold roughly, if I recall the simulation. I might be getting the numbers off. But here's the point. The question is, so think about the proverbial kind of like non-college educated person in the proverbial middle of the country. And why aren't they coming here? The narrative is they're not coming here because housing is so expensive. I think actually ground truthing that the reasons they're not coming are because they don't have the skills and social networks that would enable them to enter our job market at a level at which they would feel comfortable. Because foreign immigrants are coming, and they're coming because they have a different motivation structure. So the idea that we're going to solve the problems of Kentucky by deregulating housing in the Bay Area, I think it's a really, really far-fetched claim. And you're absolutely right that that leads to another debate, which is not only how do we deal with housing here for our people, given our migration streams, but how do we spread opportunity to the other areas of the country, which is a whole other set of really important questions that we are actively working on in my field.
Question over here,
Yes. Not only is there a concentration of high-earning people in the inner cities, but there's a concentration of cutting-edge institutions. So in San Francisco, we have so many major hospitals, but not the ability to provide hospital workers who are not necessarily low income or low skill. So we build all these institutions that we now cannot staff in the inner cities.
So you're absolutely right, and that's almost like the example of my coworker who commutes on the van pool, who is doing it, but still, it's a really big toll that it takes on her life. And let me give you sort of an example. Okay, it's a bit of an elitist example, everybody, but here it comes. Try to analogize from it. So if you look at a big institution in Manhattan, it's called New York University. New York University, so how do they get faculty to Manhattan? Well, part of it is they get them there just because Manhattan's really cool and a lot of people want to live there at almost any price. But really what NYU did many decades ago is it bought up vast tracts of lower Manhattan when it was cheap. And they build and own faculty housing, and they house their employees at way below market rates, which enables them to attract and keep talent, and also, frankly, to moderate their salary burden. And it's as they say, it's a win-win because they control the land, and the fact that land prices are appreciating in Manhattan isn't a problem for them. In many ways, it's a gain for them. So think about this. What if we had major anchor institutions like hospitals and universities and corporations that are headquartered in places go back to an idea that used to be in fashion but kind of fell out of fashion, notably among market urbanists, which is why don't they buy up land and do non-market rate housing that they control with the understanding that, frankly, a part of their workforce is simply not going to have wages that correspond to what the markets do because of income inequality. It's not because anyone is bad or good, it's because that's just the structure of things, so let's deal with it in a pragmatic way. And by the way, I know that there are a number of mayors around the country who are actually working on just those kinds of ideas. Maybe we have to get our anchor tenants involved in a big way in urban land and housing again.
Yeah.
Okay, so thank you. Sophie Hahn, Berkeley City Council. It's such a relief to come in here and academic say that your research and all your experience validates how I see the world here in the Bay Area, and as well as the mayor of Berkeley and at least one of my council colleagues. And we really struggle to try to bring a very similar narrative and get that recognized and actualize it into policy. It's hard in the Bay Area right now because there's a big industry in pushing the trickle-down theories. So we're actually working on a housing plan, an affordable housing plan for the city, which is all about social housing, because in Berkeley we can sell that. And I hope you'll help us sometime. That's not my question, but it's an invitation or maybe begging. But because we really do need the help of academics like yourself to back it up with what we're up against. But my question goes to the question of who's going to pay for all this, right? Because we see the solution as more subsidized housing, public housing, social housing, whatever you want to call it. The state is putting a little bit of money up. Our citizens have just anteed up with a bond measure for affordable housing. The county anteed up. But there's a real elephant in the room in the Bay Area. There's somebody who's profiting wildly from bringing all these people My question is, how do we get those who are profiting from bringing all these people to these rich centers to help pay for the truly affordable housing that we need to build in the region so that we can keep more people housed? How do we get them to take some responsibility for the housing crisis that their affluence is creating? That's my question.
So I think, look, I ask that question just like you do, and going from sort of the sort of my academic side of analyzing the problem to figuring out what a solution would be, that is the hard part. You know, but it's true. It's an old problem in economics and public policy more generally, which is part of the productivity of the private economy. Part of it, not all of it, is because there are public investments in the first place. We create skills through schooling. We create infrastructure. We create research and development, a lot of which is publicly funded. So there's a public contribution that ends up, and as it should, by the way, creating a productive private economy. And then there are the returns to that public investment are what we call appropriated in different ways. Some of them go to private individuals. Some of them go, say, to the worker who said, I got a good education. Look, I got an education at a public university called Berkeley, and I'm eternally grateful for the fact that the state of California gave me a below market rate public education that enabled me to do the job I do, and frankly, to join the economic elite, right? But that is, I hope, you know, that there's a return on that investment in the form of, I hope, the things that I give back to my community. But that's an open question, and you're exactly right. For when we have these very powerful processes where the economy changes, like in the third industrial revolution, and you get enormous sudden benefits flowing to a certain number of industries and a certain number of areas, right? These are what are called economic rents. And the question is, does the public sector have the policies that can bring some share of that back so they can be redistributed to counter the inequality effects and also to reinvest in making for the next round of economic growth? That's the core subject of political economy, everyone. People fight over it in every field. So I'm giving you an academic, a kind of evasive, wonky academic answer, except to say that I think that is indeed the right kind of question to ask and to figure out in these periods of super rapid but super unequal economic growth, what are the measures that we need to take care of the collateral effects of that growth?
Yes, how do we change the narrative about in-lieu fees which are afforded developers from exasperating economic segregation?
To be honest, it's a specific area of housing policy that I don't know enough about to give you a good answer on. Wish I did.
You spoke originally about how the Industrial Revolution basically concentrated populations in cities because of supply chains and so forth. The irony seems to me that at this stage of technology, industry, so-called industry, tech industry, could be anywhere, but has chosen lifestyle reasons for concentrating in cities mainly. I think that you know, they want to attract young, well-educated people who want to be in hip places. What if there were more flow of arts, culture, education to places where they originated? Federal funding cuts of those things makes urban centers even more attractive than they've been. So the problem, it just seems to me that old assumptions about cities, you know, yeah, they're exciting,
But there are other places that have grown, smaller cities, and now that's trickling away in a sense because of, you know, it's not appropriate to the stage of industry we're at right now. I guess that's my question. How do you factor that in? I mean, and let me just add that Peter Calthorpe at Berkeley, I remember in the 90s, was pushing his model of transit hubs for smaller places where they were developing transit, and now it's been grafted onto cities as the way to expand density in cities.
So let me disagree with you on point number one and sort of agree with you on point number two. So point number one was about why is there so much concentration in these metropolitan areas? And I think there's pretty much a consensus. It's not actually because of culture and amenities. They're the consequences. They're not the causes. There's actually a fundamental sort of law in economic geography, which is that every great wave of technological change, or what you might call every industrial revolution, it has what's called an agglomerative effect. And that's because when technologies are new and they depend on, and they have a learning curve, they depend on an ever kind of an ongoing flow of idea exchange and sort of rethinking and deal making. And what that does is it has the effect of creating extremely strong reasons for the people involved in those technologies or those businesses to be geographically proximate to one another. So you observe it in waves. Every time you have a big technology shock, the 1830s, the 1880s, the 1920s, and now the 1980s onward, you get a wave of urbanization and you get the spatial concentration of the highly skilled. And then after that technology gets old, once it gets old, what happens is start to move out again. They kind of fan out. That's like the suburbanization of the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And by the way, folks, that's the warning shot across the bow. Cities don't remain overheated forever. Even the Bay Area will not be the hot spot forever. I think it'll be for a while longer because I think the Bay Area is morphing from the third to the fourth industrial revolution. But cities, they go up and down. So that's number one is, and what happens is though, when you get the concentration of the skilled and the rich, then they create the amenities by the force of their demand. But that leads to your second question, which is, what could public policy do to create more widely shared amenities, both within our metropolitan regions, in the left behind neighborhoods, but also what about the rest of the country? And you're right, that's historically been the role of public policy. It's been to create public libraries and schools and good infrastructure and music and art and opportunities for people who don't live in the hotspot centers to have access to quality of life. And that's independent of their economic productivity or how much money people have. You have to decide whether it's a value or not.
In the Bay Area, we currently have something in excess of 100,000 units of housing that are fully approved, fully authorized, that are going nowhere. Because despite the high demand and the high population of people with high incomes, with the high construction and other costs, the developers just cannot make them pencil out. The CASA Compact apparently has a remedy for this, which is taxation, general taxation, that has been presented as in the neighborhood of $1.5 billion a year to go to pay the costs of these. And there's legislation working its way through Sacramento. Your take on that, please?
I'm assuming that you're talking about projects that are approved but that are not destined for high income earners?
Some of them are. Most of them are.
All units, but these projects are penciled, they're not penciling out.
The profit rate is not high enough in their current circumstances.
Ah.
It's international finance is the issue.
That's right, okay. So I actually don't know, I'm not sure that I know enough to respond to the specifics of that question. But yeah, I mean, what we have seen, I mean, I know that in some other cities that I've studied, that you have projects that are approved that don't come online because actually the projects are not satisfying an economically effective demand, meaning they're in the wrong place or they have the wrong amenities but that's not the case you're talking about.
The cost of construction and others is just so high that even with the demand, it doesn't pencil out. And again, the solution, what I'm asking about is the solution that has been proposed, which is general taxation, and the amount of $1.5 billion a year has been offered to support the developers to move these to construction.
So you're basically talking about a development subsidy. Yeah, you're talking about using, now, I think then you get into the weeds of particular public policies, and I think my initial impulse there would be subsidizing them, but then what part of the market are you going to drive these projects, this new supply toward? And my general inclination would be that it should be toward the lower 70%, because they're the ones that I think are the most suffering from the housing cost crunch.
Let's take two more questions. We've had this gentleman here for a long time, and we really, really appreciate it. Two more questions. Okay.
So I have a question going back to the housing bubble of 2008. And what seemed to happen then is that there was a lot of housing that got consolidated into the hands of fewer and fewer people.
Yeah.
And wondering how that's likely to be happening now as we see just if you can comment about the 2008 bubble and what's happening now with the consolidation of wealth and land into the hands of fewer and fewer people.
So this is, I'll say, this is not a deep area of academic expertise, but there are a number of people who are, what they're doing is documenting, what they call the financialization of the housing industry, and not just here in America, but around the world. That more and more we might call organized finance is going into housing markets. And you might contrast that to the image of several decades of, the small scale local developer, or maybe the big national developer. In those days, it would have been the big suburban homeowners like Levitt or Kaufman and Broad in the 50s and 60s. But that we've now gone to a different level of the organization of the housing and civil engineering industries, where you have very large global companies who are tapping into global housing finance circuits with a lot of securitization and a lot of global capital movements. So translated, I think, into this point is we are likely, under current circumstances, to see any kind of zoning shock, right, being responded to over time with a higher proportion of those kinds of actors than in the past, where they might have been responded to by smaller and or more domestic and or more local developers. And one thing we're trying to understand, researchers are trying to understand, is how that changes the behavior of those investors and builders in terms of what kinds of projects they're willing to do, how they price them, and how they respond to market signals, which might be different from the classical, non-globalized, smaller scale housing industry. But I think there are academics who know a lot more about that than I do, but I think it's a very relevant question.
We'll let Commissioner Richards have the next question.
Okay, Mike on. I guess the question is, it's May 30th, we've got AB 50 kind of on hold. SB 330 got out of the Senate, voted. There's another 36 to probably 100 bills out there. If we knighted you governor, and you know now what the situation is with the train coming down the tracks, what would you do in order to make a solution start to actually resonate with both sides without letting the genie out of the bottle? And we can't put it back in. I mean, that's my fear, is once the unintended consequences start, what do we do? What should we do now?
that is sort of like, as they say, above my pay grade. You know, like I'm not one of those like genius peacemakers who, you know, will have the kumbaya moment. Well, no, seriously though, I do think that the good news is we're talking about housing in California, right? We have a problem. I mean, the fact that you're all here tonight, that there are community meetings all the time, that academics are all exercised over, I think it's great. I think where we're at, the dangerous part is maybe that this one narrative has gotten so powerful and that it'll go through too quickly, and, you know, and we'll get all of these unintended consequences. And once we get this legislation passed, that what'll happen is we'll go away and we'll say, you know what, we solved the problem of affordability and trickle down, and a generation later, the inequality effects will be there, and we will have missed an entire generation of efforts where we needed to be solving the problem. So I do think, yes, we need sort of like right now, I can hear it, my colleagues are telling me, you're arguing for inaction. We have to do something now. This is urgent. What's your solution? I think the solution is a wider discussion and not a single sort of silver bullet thing.
So last flipping question. There's a homeowner who bought, you know, not that long ago, but identified 30 or 40 years ago. You didn't mention Prop 13 and the way our tax is structured in any of this discussion. Any comment on how we might be able to fund some of this through tax reform?
Absolutely. Let's be honest. Prop 13 was a disaster. It's an ongoing disaster. Right? No question about it. I can't think actually of anybody, you know, on any side of this debate in my world who thinks Prop 13 was good. It's cemented in terrible inequities in the housing market and in public finance. And so, yes, but that's a political problem, right? How do we get rid of Prop 13? That's, you know, I think actually we probably need to start a massive education campaign with the public and say, really, let's talk about it, because do you understand, you know, you all think you're just getting low taxes, but the bottom line is you're getting this horrible set of contradictory effects that are sort of tearing the society apart. And we have to start, and it'll take a while. I just got something in the mail this week because we have a proposal like 16 cents per square foot in LA a vote for public schools, and what do you get the next day? You get the Howard Jarvis Association propaganda in your mailbox. So we've got to deal with it.
I really want to thank Professor Storper. You coming all the way up into LA. You're taking a lot of your time. Thank you so much. This is an absolute fantastic.
And yes, I want to thank Zelda and Tim for inviting me, and all of you for coming. It's really an honor.
Right.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks so much. And this will be, if you go to 48hills, if you want to go back, this has been taped and it will be available.